It's a great pleasure to be here at IFPRI in your new facility and to have the opportunity to speak to Antoine and David's new work. This is a significant work. It will be something that I will reference, that I will share, and what is impressive to me, my big takeaway is what an extensive body of evidence-based policy research can be driven by a few simple ideas. And I want to share with you just a couple of the ideas which are in the core of this big work and some of the things which they stimulate me to think about. And to me, the big idea, which is obvious once you say it, but wasn't necessarily obvious to me because I spend more time thinking about manufacturing and services than about agriculture, is that a policy of agricultural protection, which is driven by farm lobbies, is the opposite of a policy which is driven by food security. And this is for the obvious reason that the first set of policies is driven at benefiting producers, and the second is driven at benefiting consumers. And so as a result, if you're doing traditional agricultural protection, you may subsidize exports, you may encourage exports, you are likely to limit imports, even prohibit some imports possibly, and that is going to have the effect of increasing prices for farmers, which is good for farmers, but it is, but it's going to, do the opposite thing in the world market. Okay, so somebody help me finish this sentence. Right, yeah. So you're going to have an abundance of food because everybody's overproducing, right? Whereas if you want to protect consumers, let's say that you have had a supply shock, you've had a run of bad harvests, and food is scarce within your country, then you're going to want to try to keep food in your country. So you may lower import tariffs that you had before, you may impose export taxes, you may prohibit exports, and as a result, that's going to mean that there's not a lot of food traded in world markets, and there's this beggar thy neighbor effect of that not only international prices are going to rise, but because world markets are thin, if everybody tries to retain food in their own borders, those prices are going to be volatile, and that is going to make a food shortage more difficult for everyone to manage. Whereas if you let the market operate, then what would happen is that countries with who had shortages could just go and import. They could buy, which if you have shortages and you're specialized in oil or services or something, this is what you're going to have to do anyway, and not be exposed to all this volatility. And so to me, that was a fairly obvious takeaway. The first thing that it made me wonder is, so what if you're a protectionist and worried about food shortages at the same time? Because there's nothing that stops governments from doing that, and in fact it's quite natural because you have farmers talking to and you have consumers talking to you at the same time. So what might happen? Well, could you actually try to pursue policies that simultaneously push down prices to consumers and push up prices for producers? And it seems odd, but you get that. I was aware, because of previous work by some of the people in this room, that India in particular had a very rigid agricultural policy, that it seems that their idea of what's right is that every farmer should receive the price that their grandfather received under the Raj, and every household should pay the price that their grandmother paid, and that nothing should have changed since then. And so as a result, what ends up happening, and that I was interested to learn, is that you have a food stockpile that attempts to feed 800 million people. It attempts, and yet the stockpile is allowed to grow even larger than that, so that it ends up operating as a form of producer price support, and having a substantial budgetary cost, and then the thing doesn't even work administratively. So if you actually are poor and you go to one of the fair price shops, there's not always even food there. And so there's challenges when you attempt to pursue more than one policy objective with a limited set of tools. The second thing that this made me think about is the fact that there are some difficult aspects to this, because when people think about what happens in a crisis, in a food emergency, there is a moral dimension to this, and non-economists have opinions which they form on somewhat natural grounds, and economists often tell non-economists that to do things which are very counterintuitive. And I ran into this recently because it's publicly known that I am an economist, including to my friends on Facebook, many of whom are non-economists. And so people often send me things like, "Hey, economist, what do you think of this?" And so I'm getting some of these as a result of Hurricane Harvey. My gosh, do you realize that there are economists in Texas who are writing op-eds against the Texas state policy against price gouging? And what this policy does is that it attempts to, in effect, criminalize people raising prices of things like gasoline and bottled water and hotel rooms in an emergency. So how could anybody be against that? And I said, well, there's an economic argument. Let me explain to you how it works. The rising price is a signal to bring in more supply. I don't think this is quite a good an argument for the hotel rooms, because it's not going to be a short room supply response. But I can tell you what the argument is. And then the response I get is that I'm Snidely Whiplash, and I personally want to dehydrate a bunch of children. And I'm like, no. I'm just trying to explain how an economic argument works. And so I'm wondering, because this book isn't the beginning of the research that you all have been doing. You've been making these arguments, since the food price spike of the late 2000s. And so I wonder about the reception that you receive when you go, especially to developing countries that are pursuing some of these policies. Because in some sense, you're making the counterintuitive argument that in the middle of a food shortage, the government might sometimes allow prices to rise, even when it somehow has the power to not do that. And it might sometimes even allow food to leave the country when there's a shortage, in the hope that you could have an international agreement that many other countries would do the same, and that would be better for global welfare as a whole. And I get the argument, and I think it's a wonderful evidence-based argument with some solid economic reasoning on it. I wonder what happens when you walk into some rooms in this planet and make that argument, what kind of reactions you get from people. And I'd be interested to hear about that in the discussion. Thanks.